Now, for more on the global economy, Ravi Ramamurti joins us live from Boston. He's a professor and director for the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Welcome to the show, Ravi.
Hi, Rachelle.
Now, G20 economies really seem to be struggling to find a common position when it comes to trade and open market issues. Some people are even hearing the term global trade war being bandied about. But how likely is that?
2 months ago, I would have been more concerned about that scenario actually panning out. But today, I feel less concerned about that. I think if you look back at what's actually happened in the last few weeks, my conclusion is that the new administration's bark is worse than its bite.
So being that we're not quite sure if what's said is actually going to translate into action, in terms of the winners and losers potentially, what could the repercussions be for the world economy if that was the case?
Well, I think what's happened so far is that the U.S. policy statements and positions of President Trump have added to the uncertainty and created a certain amount of fear around the world. Now, there is nothing good about this because all this does is create a lose-lose situation. It's not as if the U.S. gains anything when it increases fear and anxiety around the world. But the good news is the U.S. has not followed through with some of the things that it threatened to do before the elections. For instance, President Trump has not increased tariffs on Mexican imports. He has not imposed a 45% tariff on Chinese imports, has not declared China a currency manipulator, and so on. So many of those things which would have really led to scenarios which are much, much more troubling have not actually happened. So I think what's happening so far is the atmosphere has been somewhat poisoned, and I think trust between the countries and relationships have been hurt to some degree, but no serious damage has yet been done.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with the meetings with the U.S. and China. We saw U.S. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin with this stance that the U.S. is in favor of open markets and open world trade. But how do you see that being received by China and the U.S.'s other key trading partners?
I think this is reassuring. I think this is many of the cabinet members have been saying things that the rest of the world finds a lot more reassuring than some of the pronouncements that have come out of the White House. So I think China will also take some consolation in these kinds of statements. But it's ironic, I think, that today China is appearing on the world stage as if it's a champion of free trade, and the U.S. can't quite make that same claim.
Now let's look at the
dramatic reversal of roles.
Now, which of the G20 nations do you see as being the potential economic bright spots, given this uncertainty, in the future?
Oh, I think the emerging markets, which are still growing faster than many of the developed countries, so China and India and some of the other countries in Asia particularly, are still bright spots. Europe seems to be turning the corner somewhat, and it would be nice if Europe could pick up some momentum. And in the U.S., because of the stimulus program and tax cuts, there's actually a great deal of optimism. If the U.S. growth does pick up, that would help the world economy. However, that might also increase the U.S. trade deficit with many of the key trading partners with whom currently the U.S. has some issues.
So then what do you see as perhaps the biggest hurdles when it comes to this faster, more inclusive global growth that everybody seems to want, but they're struggling to find?
Well, it is, it should not be viewed as a zero-sum game, but unfortunately, it is beginning to be viewed in that light, and that tends to create a sense of rivalry among the countries as opposed to cooperation, and I think that is a matter to be concerned about. I think the trend we've seen in the last few years of world trade growing less rapidly than world GDP will probably continue, and we'll probably see more complaints being filed by the U.S. against China in the WTO and so on. And I think the outlook for some new trade agreements is much dimmer than it was before. That's for sure. So the TPP being killed is an example of that. And I don't think there will be any major initiatives, at least involving the U.S., to create new trade agreements. And that, I think, will put a damper on the growth of world trade in the coming years.
So given some of the trends that you mentioned, what are your thoughts on how trade disputes and open market issues will be handled in the world as we go forward in the next year or so?
I think we are at a critical juncture. If the kind of perspectives that have been voiced by the U.S. and by some of the candidates in some of the other countries where elections are due to be held, if that view prevails in many more countries, then it is actually possible that we could slip into a scenario in which countries decide to close off their borders and say we'd like the exports, but we don't like the imports. And that, of course, is a recipe for creating a global contraction of the kind that happened during the Great Depression. Now, the good news, I have to say, is that even as the world economy has been challenged by financial or economic crises, the country's knee-jerk reaction to want to increase protectionism has been restrained because of a rules-based system of which they're all a part. And I think it's a tribute to that system that despite the impulses to go in a protectionist direction, countries, in fact, have not actually been able to do that.
Right.
And I think, the long run, that's been good for all of the trading partners.
Well, we'll definitely have to see which direction that momentum goes. And our thanks to Professor Ravi Ramamurti from Northeastern University.